Guten Erev Shabbos. It is not a request for assisted dying, although it sounds like it. It is one of Moshe Rabbeinu's low moments of dejection. He says, if this is how you're going to treat me, he's crying out from the depths of his heart to God. He says, then please, go ahead and kill me right now. If I've found favor in your eyes, then you won't let me face my own ruin. Moshe says in the 6th aliyah of our portion this week, right after the incident of the misonenim, the complainers. He says, Im kacha at osali, horgeni na haroig, im matzasi chen beinecha, val era berasi. Moshe was facing the misonenim, the complainers. Nothing was right. Everything was wrong. Never mind that they had been released from centuries of slavery. Never mind that they had seen and heard revealed godliness at Mount Sinai. Never mind they'd been sustained miraculously with sustenance from heaven while in the desert. They complained, they kvetched, they trolled Moshe Rabbeinu. They missed what they imagined were the good things in life. What is it that they were nostalgic for under Egyptian slavery? Anyway, thankfully, God takes this little human resources meeting very seriously and sees clearly that he must help Moses learn to delegate his management challenges better before he burns out. He has to spread his workload a little more. So God suggests that Moshe convene a sort of a board of directors, essentially a Sanhedrin of 70 leaders to support and assist Moshe in the hard and challenging day-to-day work of leadership. Joshua, who's Moses' follower, ultimately his successor, is a little miffed by all this. Moshe calms him down, saying that he wishes all the people were prophets and that God would put his spirit on them. Then there wouldn't be need for any of this org chart, any of this leadership structure. We're getting into the down and dirty part of our sojourn in the desert for 40 years, which is really a series of challenges to leadership, outright attacks on Moshe's position amongst the Jewish people, and other great disappointments. There's no whitewashing the stories here. The Jewish people are not behaving well, at least some of us. And it's one crisis after another for its leaders. In a few weeks, we'll discuss the open rebellion in the portion of Korach, which God helps Moshe put down in a most spectacular fashion. The incident, it's a stark contrast to this week's, which Moshe rather puts aside with a sort of a light touch, even though he's feeling pretty distressed. Rav Sachs writes that to understand this, we have to appreciate the distinction between power and influence. They are two different things, not the same at all. How can you tell which is which? If a person has power and they share it, each individual has less power. But influence is a multiplier. So if one person influences others, influence increases. Power works by division. Influence works by multiplication. That's how Rabbi Sachs explains it. As Moshe's leadership winds down toward the end of Deuteronomy, God instructs him to give smicha to Joshua, to place his hands on him and ordain him with the same ability to influence the Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people. At that point, God instructs him to give his disciples some of his hod, his glory, which is the reserve of rulers. In this, Moshe was transferring both his influence and his power to his successor. This duality pretty much explains why Moshe took the skepticism from Joshua about appointing 70 elders so lightly, while the challenge from Korach was dealt with in such a decisive way. Spoiler alert, the earth opens up and swallows them, but we'll get there. These 70 elders were supposed to have influence over the nation, to encourage, to teach, not even really to judge, at least in this context. We can imagine them as role models, influencers, without the shallow association that the internet has given that calling. Teachers, a generation of teachers. Korach's group was something else. They were seeking power, and that was not going to be a good thing for the nation. So this is a good lens for us to view how Judaism works in our lived experience. Let's say, outside of Israel, where is there Jewish power? Power to compel you to behave in a certain way, to keep a certain degree of kosher, to pray in a certain way or believe in a certain way. We don't really have it, other than maybe societal pressure. When do you recall us persecuting heretics for incorrect beliefs? One or two cases over the last 500 or 600 years. When do you recall us checking people's orthodoxy before we allow them to join a community? If we did that, probably many or maybe even most of the rabbis would be disqualified from membership. For most of the last 1900 years, and continuing today outside of Israel, there really is no centralized religious power as such. You might have the Rav of a town, rabbi of a town. You might have a Beit Din, a rabbinic court. Some countries do have a chief rabbi. France, the UK, South Africa, and some places like Ukraine and Russia, they maybe have 2 or 3 chief rabbis. It's a great local tradition. So how do you join a community? You participate, you contribute, you show up, you be one of the people. You don't have to profess anything, you don't have to pass a test, you don't have to practice anything in particular. You don't even have to come to shul. It's nice, but you can be a member even if you don't. That's not to say that communities don't try their hand at enforcement. In the heyday of Jewish power in exile, there was the Council of the Four Lands, Vad Arba Aratzos. It functioned in the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth from the 1580s to the 1760s. This council sent delegates from various regions, not necessarily rabbis, to meet annually, more or less, and try to legislate rules that were applied across Jewish communities. You can imagine that one of their greatest powers that was given to them, actually I think by the government, was taxation. In other words, collecting dues. They made rules about who had to contribute funds to the Kehillah after they lived there for a certain period of establishing residency, and this council was given some power of enforcement by the quote-unquote real government, the temporal government. It seems to have been their downfall, actually, because by the middle 1700s, they were not successful in collecting the taxes that they had planned, and of course handing over a percentage to the government. So eventually it was dissolved. But this is, again, sort of a high watermark of Jewish communal power. The rest of the time, it's not been about power, it's been a question of influence. How and how much can some Jews, whether rabbinic leaders or political leaders or cultural figures or educators, to what extent can they exercise their influence over others? Not power, because in real terms, they didn't have much power to speak of, but their influence. So let's talk about complaining and about power and about that influence. Complaining might be seen as, depending on what mood you're in, as the Jewish people's greatest natural resource. Some lands are blessed with oil, some have sunlight, some have fertile soil. Maybe our naturally occurring resource is complaints, which does not translate into hard cash on the commodities markets. Maybe it's not only about commodities, maybe it's about futures. Maybe we're really traders in futures. Some complaining is to let off steam, no doubt about it. But the underlying assumption of much complaining is it can get better. It should get better. You, whoever we happen to be complaining to at the moment, should do something to make it better. The basic attitude of complaining is that there's room to improve and the possibility for improvement. You remember the joke about the waiter who comes to the table and says to his Jewish customers, "Ladies, is anything all right?" Okay, we have a reputation for being tough customers. But you know what that means? It means we have high standards. Not a bad thing at all, depending on if you use it for the right things. About the questions of power and influence, there may be a clue for us in the very beginning of the Parsha. God says to Moshe, "Daber el Aaron achicha," say to your brother Aaron, "V'amarte lav, Behaalosecha es haneros." Tell him when he lights the lights, el mul pnei hamnora, ya'iru shivas haneros. They should cast their lights toward the face of the menorah. All the commentators note this uncommon expression, Behaalosecha. We'd be much more used to the expression of kindling lights as hadlaka, like we say in lahadlik ner shel Chanukah or lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, for example. Behaalosecha has this unique expression of when you cause the lights to go up, meaning you have to hold your fire to the wick until it remains lit and lights on its own even without your help. That's exactly what influence is. You hold your light close to someone else's until they're illuminated as well and can stay lit even when you back away, when you take your source of warmth away. We're trying to light up all the souls of Israel. so that each sheds its own individual light towards the face of the menorah. But listen to the power aspect. The next verse begins, Vayas Kain Aharon. Aaron did it. What would you think? Aaron would not do a mitzvah like this? The Sifri says this shows the praise of Aaron. He did exactly as he was commanded. He could have done it in a different order. He could have delegated the work, the task, to another Kohen. He could have changed something. Aaron was a great leader of Israel, and yet he did not use his power to do anything other than what he was commanded. He did not change. He did not deviate. If those in power think that the rules apply to them any less than others, they put the whole system in jeopardy. Aaron was faithful to his task. Well, not exactly a happy ending to the tale in our parsha, but not entirely sad. The Jews, the complainers, the misonanim, they got their meat, their quail. They had their desires satisfied. Some overdid it. It did not go well for them. The Jewish people lived to complain another day. Moshe lived to lead and teach and try to influence for the good. And we continued our march towards the promised land. That takes us to the parsha of the spies, Shalach. Another set of mixed messages, more mixed opportunities. This next one is costly and results in our turning a short march home into 40 years of exile and hopefully cleansing and learning the lessons from it. The question always to ask is, what have we learned from the experience? Have we learned to get along any better? Have we learned not to give in to every inclination, every desire? Have we learned that power for its own sake does not keep currency very long, and influence to nurture the hearts and souls of our fellow, that's really where it's at. The Jewish people have a lot to learn. To our eternal benefit, God is very, very patient with us, even as we make some of the same mistakes over and over. Please God, may we merit at least to make some new mistakes of our own as we move forward, closer to the promised land, and not only repeat the mistakes of the past. And of course, we pray and we hope and we're trying to get many things right along the way at the same time. A good Shabbos.